Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Dixon. I'm the principal of this college, Green Templeton. As you've heard, we are recording this event tonight, so we will be able to play it from our website. So we take it if you ask a question at some point that you are implicitly giving your consent to appear on the recording. I'm delighted to be hosting this event tonight, which is generously supported by the Green Templeton College Principal Circle. So thank you to members of the circle, some of whom are in front of me immediately. I think this is a fantastic initiative. The aim in setting this event up was to help create a forum at the college to talk about issues related to business and enterprise, and at the same time offer an opportunity for our students to hear from and connect with thinkers and business leaders from Oxford and beyond. So with this in mind, we were delighted to be able to bring James Cameron to Oxford here this evening. James has been described as a radical in a suit. He's true to form, he's wearing a suit tonight. He's a barrister, independent advisor and social entrepreneur, and a recognised leader of the global climate change community. He's a friend of the COP26, advising the presidency. He's a London Sustainable Development Commissioner and a member of the advisory board for Heathrow 2.0. James was co-founder of the climate change practice at Baker McKenzie, a negotiator on behalf of the Association of Small Island States at the UNFCCC, and advisor to the Morocco and Fiji COP presidencies. He then became a co-founder and chair of Climate Change Capital, the world's first green investment bank, and he's now senior advisor for Pollination, climate change advisory and investment firm, as well as System IQ, Tolchan Communications, and AIA Capital. He's also held academic posts at Cambridge, London, Bruges, and Sydney, and is currently affiliated with the Yale Centre for Environmental Law and Policy. Tonight, he'll be talking to one of our MBA students, Emily Buckley. Emily's achievements as a strategy manager at Lightsource BP, which manages solar power around the world, included securing investments from the governments of the UK and India to start a green private equity fund. In 2019, she was on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for European manufacturing and industry, and was listed as one of the BP's 8 women advancing this energy transition. She's currently studying for an MSc in Sustainability, Enterprise and the Environment. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Emily and James to entertain us.
Well, I'm going to speak for a while, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then hopefully we'll have a conversation with you. So the theme of this evening is to take an idea that I created when I started an organisation called Climate Change Capital, and interpret what I meant by the phrase creating wealth worth having, and then move on to a conversation, an intergenerational conversation about climate, to really have a look at where the conflicts lie, different perceptions of risk, different perceptions of what the answers might be, but also to look at how one could cooperate, share skills and expertise, and remove the risk that we waste energy disagreeing when we don't need to. And then just to finish up with an exhortation to look at how business and enterprise, and I prefer enterprise because it reaches a bit beyond the category of business, and those in the room who know about the origins of the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment know that I was trying very much to use that word rather than business, because I think it is broader. But I also wanted to perhaps finish up with a suggestion that we probably are due another round of creativity in the structures that aggregate capital, deploy capital in order to achieve public goods outcomes, but outcomes where there isn't friction between wealth created that undermines natural capital and wealth created that supports and sustains natural capital. So those are the three parts. So creating wealth worth having, now I have to admit that this phrase emerged through a ghastly corporate ID mission building process. When I started Climate Change Capital, I was very reluctant to join in on. But ultimately, the phrase arrived in conversation with my colleagues because every word in the sentence matters, and it matched what we were trying to do in naming an organization, Climate Change Capital, making it very obvious that we were trying to respond to a problem that I'd worked on all of my working life from the very beginnings of my legal career, by channeling capital into the solutions, by taking a conversation that had been situated, at least in my experience, in law, diplomacy, public policy making, a governmental realm where most of the actors were NGOs or advocates of one kind or another, but actually the key force for moving financial resources into solutions were largely absent. And it was impossible to imagine solutions to climate change emerging without the active and consistent participation of those who held the capital and required incentives to move in a different direction. So Climate Change Capital was founded with a very strong desire not to trade off economy versus environment, not to accept that there was a necessary distinction between making financial returns and delivering environment. And we were fully aware that that was going to be hard to do. We were pioneers. We would try to do things for the first time. We had the first specialist green building responsibility fund, first private equity fund that was focused on clean technology in this country. And we had a private sector fund driven by a price for carbon. And that emerged out of having done the legal work to set up the systems, having advised the European Commission on the regulation for an emissions trading system, having negotiated the international treaties on behalf of all the small island states to set conditions in which a value for reducing greenhouse gas emissions could be created in a market setting. Finding the money to go behind that meant going for mainstream investors, pension funds, for example, big institutional investors, parceling out the capital into specialist vehicles, but also advising companies and entrepreneurs and developers who were building the new businesses, mostly in renewables then. But there was an awful lot of work done to take businesses out of big energy companies, BP and Shell being a classic example, and they come back in again many years later. But a lot of the advisory work we're doing, building enterprises that had the solutions to climate change, specifically in the power sector, mostly work. So we thought, well, what unifies, what brings all this together? We had a very unusual organization. We had people who were in private equity, who were in investment banking, but also we had the person that ran Friends of the Earth's climate campaign at a very young age, who's now a very well-known leader of a philanthropic organization. We had people who came from very different backgrounds. We had an internal policy unit because we knew that we were not going to be able to deploy this money unless there was a change in the regulatory structure, unless there were new incentives. And we were very transparent about that. We wanted to argue to governments, you set those incentives right. And by the way, this might be a model, have a look at this, and we'll bring the capital behind it. So it never bothered me that someone would say, oh, that's very self-serving. I said, well, yeah, it is. I want the money to do this. I'm telling you very clearly, I want the money to achieve this outcome. I'm not promising you superior returns. I'm promising you, if you give me the money for this purpose, I will be a steward of that money and I'll make sure it delivers this purpose. That was it. So it turns out that creating wealth worth having does translate quite well into the languages. And if you break it up into the bits, it's interesting. Building enterprises is creative. There's lots of individually creative things you can do when you build an enterprise, but having the idea, finding the people, combining the right talents, ensuring that the structures are built that help you deliver the outcome you want. It's a very creative act. Perhaps a story not often told, that the creating part was about enterprise building, as well as the natural association between those words, creating wealth. Wealth is a bigger word than money. Wealth of nations, wealth has more resonance to it than financial return. It's a bit like the difference between home, you say it to yourself, it resonates in your chest, and house. They have overlapping meanings, but they don't feel the same when you say it. And so wealth was a better word for me. And worth having, well, what is the worth of wealth? Again, that's not just financial return. Look at the obverse. Is it worthwhile pouring capital into something that is wholly extractive, that in the end depletes your natural capital and creates a harm to the atmosphere that causes suffering and loss and economic damage? At the very least, pause and think about that. Let's not assume that the means by which financial return can be achieved is the same as creating wealth worth having. I would like to be proud of work done to create the kind of wealth that was worth having because it delivered these benefits beyond merely a financial return for an investor or a shareholder. And we might come back to some of those duties or board duties. That's something, an issue that I'm interested in now that I've been working on, and I think shows signs of where we might be headed. So creating wealth worth having was an idea that helped explain what climate change capital was for. It provided a way of bonding quite different types of people in the organization. It didn't help us survive the climate change, the financial crisis. It didn't produce a magical result at the end, although I think we were very successful until the point that we weren't. But I'd like to think that the concept is still a good one to hold in your head when imagining the creation of enterprise that we need in order to deal effectively with the climate change problem and the problem of natural capital depletion and the loss of nature and biodiversity upon which we absolutely depend. So, middle section, I'm really interested in this intergenerational. We'll talk about it, but I really think that there is something profound at risk, but also offering potential in a dialogue between generations on climate change. And I know these conversations are going on all over the world, sometimes fractious, sometimes really, really quite challenging. Young versus old. Sometimes manifested very obviously in political outcomes, sometimes in completely different perspectives about risk and danger and what priorities are. A lot of blaming, a lot of challenge to orthodoxies. And really what I'm trying to suggest is that let's not pretend that conflict doesn't exist, but let's use the energy productively. Let's try and understand these different perceptions of risk and the solutions that might emerge. One of the areas I'm quite concerned about is that when the debate becomes too polarized, you start to shut your mind off the possibility that someone who's not in your tribe has the answer. Climate change is a hugely dispersed, very complex issue. Nobody's got all the answers. It doesn't help to split communities when you might need the help of someone who you think is on the other side of the debate. Now, that doesn't mean that all things are relative. They are not. There are some pretty strong absolutes. And we might want to investigate where some of those absolutes settle. I've just been recording a podcast, which is specifically in this dimension. My goddaughter is. So in the field, as it were. We've tried to look at some of the what we call the whatabouts. There's a lot of whataboutism in this debate. What about China? Why should we do anything? What about China? What about the fossil fuel companies? Why should we deal with them? What about nuclear? What about this? And we try to work through this because they often feature in these intergenerational conversations. But the challenge that comes with that "what about" phrase, often put very aggressively or passive aggressively. And we thought we'd better work through them and just have a conversation to see where we could find common ground. And you may have different perspectives on this. I don't claim to speak for an entire generation any more than my God, but there are differences. I would suggest that in many instances, there is an antagonism towards a corporate solution to climate change, held passionately by a younger generation, deeply skeptical about the capacity of the private sector and private corporations to deliver solutions. On the other hand, I suggest that some of the technology solutions are more easily accepted. So someone of my generation might be skeptical about the possibility of switching to 100% renewables, whereas somebody in a younger generation think, well, why not? We could probably do that. Nuclear is quite an interesting divider. A lot of people of my generation before campaigns against nuclear, whereas a younger generation might think, well, looks like that could be a solution. It might rank alongside some of the other solutions. It might be a bit like hydrogen, not the whole answer, but part of the answer. It might come in smaller packages. It might not look like 3 Mile Island. But that is an area where I want us to think about what are the technology solutions? What's the appetite for technology fixing the problem? Where are the edges of that? I'd like to explore that some more. My hunch is that if you do have an open conversation between generations, where there's a capacity to share experience and expertise, but also to learn new ways of managing what is a phenomenally helpful trend for climate change solutions, namely the digitization and electrification of pretty much everything in our economy. We'll get to that in a minute. Then I think we're going to find that we get to the solutions faster. We don't trip each other up. We can start building, societal confidence in a transition that is fit for the future. And maybe before I move on to the next section, I'll just dwell there a little bit. I am really conscious of a legacy that hands some real problems to the next generation. I do feel like my generation ought to be in service to the generation behind us. There is a debt, but there's also some pretty good stuff to hand on to. And I want to just leave with something in this part that I feel quite confident in now. It is the result of some brilliant innovation that's taken place in my working life, which is, I think we can be confident that a large chunk of the climate change problem, which is situated in the energy sector, will be resolved in time because of what is already happening in power, in storage, in the digitization and the use of electrons as opposed to molecules. I'd like to suggest to you that we are winning in a pretty fundamental way. I mean, solar, batteries and other renewables, they are winning on cost. They are displacing fossil fuels in power generation. The same is happening with batteries. We are capable of managing electrons very effectively digitally. We are driving fossil fuels out of our economy. Demand is flattening and starting to decline. China is in the center of this story. We might want to return to that. It's more complicated these days than when I first worked on things in China. We had a big business in China, climate change capital. But there's no doubt that China are delivering solutions in huge numbers to us, and their economy is electrifying fast. They're becoming an electro state already. And it's happened in a decade. So I think you're allowed to be very positive. I've often asked if I'm optimistic, pessimistic, I'm possibilistic. I think if you look at what's happening in energy and power, you're entitled to be confident. There are other areas that need more work. Finally, we are in a moment of stress. Our economies are flat. They don't have high levels of productivity. We don't have high confidence of getting back to those levels of growth that we aspire to. We even have many question marks about what kind of growth. We have corporate structures that are becoming immensely complex. You go back to the origins of joint stock limited liability companies, which frankly changed the world, allows us to raise capital, deploy capital, spread risk, build enterprises, move goods and services around the world. Extraordinary innovation in corporate structure and legal structure, which the Dutch and the British obviously dominated for a long time. Now immensely complex and often separating out responsibility and liability, and very, very, very complicated structures that are often obfuscating and lose clarity of mission. And you used to be able to stand up in Fleet Street and say, I've got a vessel, this is its name, it's going to the East Indies, it's going to get nutmeg. Are you in? Yes, I'm in. For nutmeg from the East Indies, but if you go somewhere else and get something else, I'm not in that. My liability is limited to what you're going to go and get. Pretty clear mission with risk attached to it. We've lost a lot of that in our highly complex corporate structures. We also have separated out public goods and private gain in a way which is extreme. We have NGOs, we have charities. We have a small variations since David Cameron's big society ideas, a few little structures that we can use, interest corporations and the like. But we still largely separate the two. This is for government, this is for charity, philanthropy, this is for private sector. Changes at the margins with duties of directors, not just to shareholders, but to other stakeholders. That is happening, but still too far apart. And my sense is that this is a moment to really look hard at what structures might be better at working alongside government, public policy and delivery of public goods, but where there is a reward associated for that delivery. And still generate income that can be called profit or could be called reinvestment. But it's not charity. It's not for something, it's for something. And those structures need some work. I feel like we haven't done enough creating in that area. We need to build better businesses with clearer purposes that enhance natural capital on the one hand, bring solutions to these complex problems like climate change, where we can organize capital, direct capital, reward investment, and be sure that we're aligned with delivering public good and not displacing the cost to someone else. And in the end, the cost gets picked up by society. Why should we build structures that help the separation between the generation of private wealth where the cost is subsidized by the public? That doesn't make any sense. But our innovation has got to be just as good on the social structures, because that's what companies are, they're little societies. And I still feel that that is the right way to go for a mixed Western style liberal democracy, as opposed to one where the state assumes authority and control over economic activity. And as a parting shot, I can recall quite clearly reading Tom Paine as an undergraduate, thinking that radical, his suit probably wasn't very sharp, I must say, Tom Paine is a bit disheveled, but that radical really, really understood that the ability, the freedom to form your own enterprise in what was then would have been a merchant class or the various craft-based businesses was good protection against abuse of power. It was a good way of controlling those who would otherwise control you, whether they're the monarchy, which is Paine's main concern, or the government. And I feel like our ability to self-organize our response to these complex problems is critical, and we need to enhance that ability, build better structures for doing it, garner the best kind of capital, create innovative industry to respond, and feel like the net result is that you've created wealth worth having.
Great, thank you so much, James. That was a really compelling introduction. I think we'll spend about 10 minutes doing a little Q&A and then open this up to the audience. So I'm sure there are some great questions waiting in the background, so please get them ready. But just to start off for a few questions first. So I'd love to start with this metaphor, the radical in the suit. Specifically, how important is the suit in that, and what do you think it symbolises, and how does it relate to environmentalism?
Yeah, it was Michael Liebrecht who adopted that phrase. I'm not sure where it came from originally, but it's true that I started off as a barrister. I taught law as well as practice. The professions all have uniforms of one kind or another, ways of presenting yourself. When I started out, I was, very conscious of the wig and the gown and wearing all this paraphernalia to present. And you realise that it does have a function. It helps you realise that it isn't about you. You're wearing something that allows you to represent somebody else's interests as best. I also wanted to be able to advance ideas that I was fired up by as a young international lawyer. And I know I needed credentials for that, and it helps to have credentials from good places like this. But also to be able to communicate those ideas without being quickly rejected by the audience you need to persuade. Now, my particular audience then was either a courtroom or a diplomatic negotiations. And I was bringing some very challenging ideas. And when we started, the Alliance of Small Island States, I'm really quite proud to be a part of. That followed a legal opinion I wrote for Greenpeace in 1988 or so, a law review article I wrote with Derwent Zelke, didn't come out until 1990, it was in that 88-89 period. And then we first built this coalition of small island states in November 1990 in Geneva, second World Climate Conference. Okay, none of that had happened before. It's outrageous for a 20-something-year-old lawyer from the UK to build a coalition of small island states all around where I had no nationality connection at all. But you couldn't have done that unless in some way you'd got some front, some way of presenting yourself that allowed you just to get in enough. And then the iteration between how things are normally done and how things are done differently, that sometimes depends on, certainly in my case, total naivety, like, why can't you? Why not do that? But also the sense that I have those, I can go up against another international law. I don't care how old they are or what country they come from. I know my stuff. And these are my ideas. But you still need to communicate in dress form in that setting something that allows you to solidly present your ideas. There are other settings where it isn't necessary. And there are other uniforms, other places where you wear different. I happen to love clothes anyway, so I'm interested in them, right? And there's an art in that, there's a creativity in what you wear and who you wear it for, and there's a certain respect that you can have for your audience by choosing to wear this rather than that. And if you're looking to connect in order to persuade, what you wear does matter. Yeah, it does. It's part of your presentation. It's part of your advocacy. And you can play with it. All great designers do. They have classic forms and they change the shape or the color or the cut, whatever it is. That's fine too. That communicates.
Thanks, James. Could you sort of go into type of camouflage, or is that going a bit too far?
No, it's not going too far. Not going too far. I've always, this is going to sound quite weird, I'm sorry. I've always loved chameleons. Chameleons are so cool. I mean, just cool. And the notion that I remember writing a short story about this when I was much. I like the idea of a chameleon that would actually search for colours, knowing that it could change colour. Love that idea that they might seek out this particular branch. I do think it helps sometimes to be able to camouflage or to blend, but not so that you are. Yeah, you don't want to hide from it. You want to be able to position yourself to make whatever case it is you want to make. And it doesn't, everybody who does communication knows that it really matters that you know who your audience is. That you can parcel up your message 15 different ways if you have to. so that you reach. Right? And the climate change problem, I mean, I came to it without any prior knowledge. I came to it as a lawyer looking at evidence, not come to it out of the environment movement. But once I learned about it, I couldn't unlearn. And it's complicated. I liked the complication, but I also knew that if you were going to be a successful advocate in and out of a courtroom, in a negotiation, but also in the other places of power, you need to pitch your language in a way it would get received, to be understood and acted upon by the other group. And you need to be very clear about where the power lay. I didn't have it, just words and ideas and arguments. But someone over there might have it. How do I speak to them? Someone over there might have it a different lever to pull. How do I speak to them? What will connect with them and enlist their support? Because I need their help to get this done. So many languages, lots of translation, lots of different types of communication, lots of ways of getting into a community or a section of the society that you needed to work with in order to solve the problem. To stop it becoming far too abstract and connecting it to people's everyday lives. That needed sometimes some counterpart or some change of presentation.
It sounds like you've done a very good job with it. I'm just going to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience, just in the interest of time. And I think this is perhaps, at least from my point of view, the most important question that I prepared, which is that you talk about the ability of suits to help us solve environmental challenges, and you talked about what you've done in your career. But I guess studying with a lot of people who are even younger than me in their 20s, there's a lot of cynicism, and really, I guess, pessimism around the ability of business to solve this challenge, and the feeling that business is the problem, not the solution. And I know you spoke about it a bit in the introduction, but it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on why you have the opinion that you do on this, because I think a lot of young people are, as you mentioned, quite unconvinced.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that has to do with trust and broken trust and the feeling that, in some sense, especially the very large corporations, have separated themselves out from the rest of us. They're living in a world of outsized profits with extraordinary incentives, and the uncomfortable feeling that particularly those at the very top, and you see it in finance, but also in the digital world and in energy. These corporations are now enormous. They're bigger than countries. I mean, I probably ought to have a stat that will tell you just how many of the largest companies in the world are bigger than countries around the world. It's pretty staggering how much private capital power is vested in such a small group of enterprises. And many of the feelings of anger, and maybe sometimes envy, who knows, but certainly anger at those who are at the top of these enterprises, comes from the fact that they get enormous wealth from running these enterprises, but they don't really take responsibility for all that goes on in those enterprises when something goes wrong. There is a claim which is very easy to challenge, that I'm worth it at the top because I am in command of X tens of thousands or 100,000 people, but we all know that they're not. And anyone they're not, they can't be. It's a complete illusion. Right? And so whenever you get a real challenge to that authority, it's so easy, whether it's in a courtroom or in a public inquiry, to say, well, I didn't know that was going on. So-and-so didn't tell me. And you want to say, well, okay, I fully believe that, but you still collected X million a year because you were apparently all seeing, all knowing, and in total control of the entire operation all around the world. And it's just not credible, and yet it hasn't really changed. So I understand the motivation, I get the anger, I feel there is a sense of mistrust, I need to unfairness. I also sense that outsized wealth is almost always, and this may be a historic view, based upon somebody taking something from someone else that have not properly paid. Okay. However, I do, as you heard, I do believe that business is a form of enterprise that has a societal base. It's about self-organization to do something. And I'm a big fan of that. I think a lot of the creativity and innovation you need is going to come from those places. I'm skeptical about whether the large energy companies, for example, are going to innovate sufficiently away from fossil fuels when fossil fuels are the base of their business. They have great management skills. I rather hope they'll come out of their fossil fuel company and into something else, and we can use their skills. But I want to beat them. I want to beat the fossil fuel companies fair and square in a competitive space with electrons that are green. And I want to make sure that the concept, the idea of business enterprise is not captured by that form of business. I think we can do better. Now, I do have a dilemma, which is the transition is frighteningly difficult. Persuading institutional investors that Shell or BP should be broken up into a good bank or bad bank separation, which I think is a great idea, is going to be really hard. It's also true that our privately listed private corporations that we invest in through our pension funds and the like, they are a wholly different type of organization to a state-owned oil company in China or the Middle East. They're just not the same thing at all. However, I still have confidence in the idea of enterprise in multiple different forms, enterprise that can raise and deploy capital, deliver outcomes, being a preferred option than convincing yourself that the enemy is the corporation. That I don't see any real prospect of success. If you like, I was unconvinced, for example, by the Naomi Klein approach to solving climate change. You know, I could read the introduction of the first section of her book saying, yeah, I know all this, I've done all this before, fine. What's the solution? And the solution is a kind of anti-capitalist tirade, and it's boring because it's not going to happen. It's not happening in a very productive way at all. Whereas a lot of the people who are fired up about doing something on climate change are attracted to that because it does create enemies, it does create villains, and that does help run campaigns. It does. We all know that. So I feel as if you somehow got to find that energy and that commitment to change and channel it towards something more constructive, more creative, and not to waste time and energy attacking the corporate actor exclusively, or rather lazily, because there are bad actors. It's perfectly proper to attack, but not the idea of the corporation. Let's think creatively about how to make that corporation structure better, more useful, more directed. That would be, I think, a better approach. And there are things going on right now. Actually, there is a better business movement underway. There are people arguing for a better business act of Parliament with great different obligations on directors. There are cases already looking at directors' duties. Some of them have not been successful, but I don't know. Some of you might know that cases brought against Shell directors. I think if you had another go with that case, different judge, you might win that one again. So I think there's a sense that there's something happening that's constructive that might help capitalism to reinvent itself without having to, be supplanted by something completely different.
I think we'll open up for questions now. So, did anyone have one to start with? Yeah, which ones?
Good evening, sir. I can't help but wonder why there is no mention of India, Indian talks. I'm from India, so it was only about China. I do have two questions for you. One is first on you being the advocate of climate change and about this transgenerational wealth creation, and second being you a barrister and a negotiator. So the first question is like India is it's the fastest growing economy. Like right now we are in the fourth place. And you on your talk, you were also mentioning about the UK businesses not being proactive. So we are maintaining a 7 to 7.2 rate of growth, and we are also the fifth in greenhouse gas emissions. So like when it comes to COP and even in the United Nations, India consistently argues that this is our time. The West has already developed, so it is our time to develop. So it is the West who should take responsibility, and we will keep continuing emitting gases into the atmosphere. So how do you? What is the outlook for India then? So that is my first question. And coming to the transgenerational wealth creation, so India has a very good demographic dividend. Like most of the Japan and the West population is aged. So in the next couple of decades, like India has a point to say when it comes to any matters in the world. So how do you? What is the outlook for India in that sense? That is my first question. Okay.
So there's two there. Let me get. So I should really have quite right. Should have talked about India. As it happens, I work quite closely with an Indian family conglomerate, I suppose you call them. And I'm very aware of what's going on in India. And having done the climate negotiations for so many years, very aware of the Indian delegation and how they argue, what they argue in the climate negotiations. And nothing happens in the climate negotiations until the Indian delegation decides that an agreement is possible. And they often hold up agreement. So the first thing is that India is a very, very good proving ground for technology innovation, climate change. So I'll give you an example from my work. So I work with a company called Sun New Energy Holdings, and Sun Mobility is an electric vehicle battery swapping business, and growing very fast across India, many 15 cities I think now. Now, when that technology is applied in practice, it allows a last mile delivery driver to come up to a kiosk, and the smaller ones are about this big, with a fob, open the kiosk, take out a battery, put it in the vehicle, drive off roughly 65 kilometers before it needs to recharge. That transaction happens on the side of the road or in a forecourt, used to be for petroleum or diesel. The speed of repowering that vehicle is faster than filling it full of liquid fuels. All the GPS, all the data, all the GPS is all in the battery. So if he's part of a fleet or he's in a business that's tracking his miles, it's all the data is there. And those drivers are choosing those vehicles on economic grounds. They're not choosing them because they're members of Greenpeace or because they're really knowledgeable about the climate negotiations. If those technologies can be applied at scale in India, of course, they can be applied at scale anywhere in the world. It's an Indian invention. It's an Indian manufacturing process. It's an Indian investor. All the experience is developed in India for the benefit of the world. There are several sectors that are currently dominated by China. China is number one in solar, number one in wind, number one in batteries, number one in electric vehicles. But India is rapidly competing, at the very least at the software interconnections between them all. Because in the end, the new system has to integrate generation, storage, use, management. That's a software problem. India is very well placed to do that. India's, it's full of all sorts of other problems. There's not a panacea there, but it's going to be one of the parts of the world where the solutions emerge. It's also a great proving ground for why one can move away from fossil fuel generation on national economic grounds. It's also full of reasons not to, and that's to do with vested interest in the fossil fuel industry. But on cost, solar will be fossil fuel generation for electrons in India now. And I don't see any reason why the big targets that have been set in India for solar don't produce the kind of transformation which has already happened in China. I'm very confident that India is going to be a major in the transition to a new energy economy, and it will do so with the benefit of a huge young population that will be able to build an economy that is not dependent on fossil fuels, which is the largest cost to the Indian economy on its balance sheet, the importation of fossil fuels. So the next generation of Indian citizen will have the engineering capability, the access to capital, and the obvious economic benefit of letting go of fossil fuels, which is why there's often a difference between what the Indian delegation in the climate change negotiations argue, a lot of argument against the North and West for having created the problem, often very different from the very competent entrepreneurs and investors in India who have the solutions. And so I think sometimes the Indian delegation of diplomats ought to spend more time talking with Indian business. Actually, funny enough, you can see this if you go to a COP. I'm sure you see. If you look at the size of the Indian pavilion at the climate negotiations, has anyone been to climate negotiations? Okay. So if you walk around, the pavilions are great indicators of how a nation wants to present itself to the world. It's like a trade fair. It's part of the negotiation. The Indian delegation is huge. It's confident. We are going to take over the world. We are going to do it. Look at our big business. Look at it. We're hot. You go into the halls, and there's still Indian delegates talking about the new international economic order of 1975. And you cause any problems, we're going to do nothing unless you give us the money. Two different worlds.
Gentleman at the back, and then we'll come to the front.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed when you started to talk about what you were meaning by wealth. And I think we need to redefine what that wealth is. Wealth is not financial, as you suggested. It's wealth that we as a society can live on and we need to generate that broader definition of wealth. But the other thing that I found very interesting was your discussion on transformation. And the change has to be transformation. And I think that's one of the things. I work on climate change adaptation, which is different than what you've been talking about. But what I'm really interested in is the things that I'm hearing and seeing around the world that are preventing us from addressing the climate change issue, not only from an adaptation side, but a mitigation side, is often related to the inability or unwillingness to transform some of this governance structures that we have. And I think that's what you were hinting at.
Yeah.
That relationship between government and that relationship with government and business.
Yeah.
And so there needs to be something done in that area.
Yeah,
And there's two initiatives that I'm really trying to follow and understand. One is Earthshot and what the Prince is trying to do with his Earthshot. But the other is that the announcement that was made, I think it was today, in the US, the 9 projects that they're going to fund, and I forget the number of millions of dollars that are associated, or it might even be more than that.
Out of the IRA, out of the.
Yes, out of that. And what they're trying to do is, what I think is the wealth, is the building of skills of our youth to address 9 different aspects. So they want to build skills but at the same time, give them jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to start thinking about in the broader issue. And I think that's that transformation. We're starting to get the transformation right.
So it's true that I do mean transformation, not just in a technological sense. And however, I worked with this gentleman down here in the front on a project that he led at the Martin School, actually, which really helped me figure out how the exponential in technology might work in combination with our efforts to transition a society to deal with climate change using fantastic work from Joan Farmer and others in the mathematics department. And the simple message from that work at the Martin School was that accelerating the transformation reduces cost to society and builds resilience to that society as well. So the faster you go, it's counterintuitive, the faster you go, the safer it is. And once you understand the context of risk, climate, and once you see that there are alternatives available, the faster you get them away from fossil fuels towards the alternatives, the safer and more resilient your society becomes. You don't automatically build the kind of adaptation resilience you're also referring to, but by reducing risk, you increase the chances that you can adapt and build more resilience into your economy. And then there's a whole series of initiatives that you can undertake that help you build, say, physical resilience at the coastal zones, planting mangroves or withdrawing from the sea. Or there are all sorts of ways in which you can rethink the way in which agricultural communities have resilience built in because you have protected a watershed, not directly where the agricultural productivity is, but close by. And these sorts of strategies you get more time to do if you've accelerated the energy transition, for example. And that's an interesting relationship, I think. And yes, obviously, for all economies everywhere, all political economies everywhere, jobs matter. They matter in India. Think of all the Indian engineers who are looking for work. So a political strategy for transformation has got to involve the kind of wealth that engages several different parts of the and again, I feel pretty optimistic about this. And if you look at the sorts of jobs that can be created in the energy transition, they're attractive and plentiful. And I don't see any reason why one should be fearful of the transition from that point of view. I think it's an area where, again, one could be confident. I'm conscious, there's more questions and I want to answer them. So.
I think the lady at the front and then gentleman next to her.
Thank you so much for the talk, James. And I just, it's not a very technical question that I have, but more of I'm seeking some career advice from you here. I really like your ability to be able to blend in so many disciplines in your career. And if I may say so, I'm sure your legal training as a barrister holds you in good stride. I say this because I'm myself a lawyer turned academic, and now I'm first year deeper in law. And I look at literature on human rights. I look at the slavery in supply chain management and disclosure obligations in various businesses in the global south. So my question to you is, what are the strategies that you recommend should you need to create to pivot into businesses as a lawyer, coming from a very hardcore legal background? What are the strategies that you recommend while also maintaining a very strong sense of purpose as you have?
So I think I was very lucky. I had an academic base. I loved teaching. As a barrister, you have independence. I was my own trading name. And that is very helpful. I wasn't dependent upon any particular client or I never really appreciated the business element to law. I don't believe law is a business. I know you can make it one, but it isn't. It's professional. It's a very different thing. So I've massively valued my independence. it's not that I wanted to exclusively work for one type of client. I didn't. I think variety is helpful. But I didn't want to be trapped in a billable hour culture where more and more and more was considered to be better and better and better. That's not for me. So I would argue that if you can take your legal skills into an enterprise that you can represent and be confident that you are doing useful professional work to help that enterprise succeed, that's lovely. I think a lot of the work that boards need now to cope, frankly, with the complexity of these issues, a lot of boards are going to struggle. Now we have what's called TNFD coming towards boards now. We have climate change scenario planning and reporting required for boards. We have some legislation that is interpreted in ways that the Companies Act that really do extend directors' duties. And we have cases all over the world, climate litigation all over the world. Some of the human rights-based cases. I don't know whether you've seen the cases in Switzerland, the Swiss Grannies case. It's called remarkable, right? Where constitutional courts are saying to governments, go back and do better, right? If you really want to honor your duties to these citizens, go back and do your climate change law better. And we're not telling you exactly what to do. That's not our role, that's your role. But this isn't good enough. This isn't going to meet your obligations in law to your citizens. Very interesting. So I think if you wanted to go into a corporate career with law, the range is much bigger now. What you can usefully offer to your decision makers inside the company, and it will cover many different legal subjects, so it can be fascinating, provided you're aligned with what they do.
Thank you.
I think to the gentleman at the front.
Thank you. So I'd like to get your thoughts on something which I see as a problem, which is really, I haven't spoken about directly, is that of the 8 billion people in the world, about 3/4 of them live in squalor in varying degrees. And the UN and the World Bank have estimated that let's take 5 billion excluding China, at least 5 billion people to live a more sustainable life, be able to have water to drink and toilets and girls educate, all that, is going to cost $30 trillion over the next 20 years. It's a massive amount of money, right? It's not going to come from government lending, bilateral. It's not going to come from the World Bank and these MDGs that are not fit for purpose. Exactly. So we're talking about having to get $1 trillion a year roughly. I'm sorry. $1 trillion a year roughly from private institutional capital in the capital markets. That means insurance companies, pension funds, and most of it. What thoughts do you have about how we can get our act together? And this is urgent. This is not something I can put off. How do we divert, let's say 10% of the total private savings, $130 trillion in the OECD and these. How do we divert that money? Who's going to do it? How is it going to be done? To me, this is and even climate change is to some extent a result, it's going to be a result of this problem, not an independent cause, right? At the same time, they have so much debt and
it amplifies and increases the risk of all the things you talk about. And we were just having a conversation earlier about how actually our capital markets are pretty inefficient. I mean, they're supposed to be a strength, but they're actually pretty inefficient at deploying real capital for real investments that real people enjoy. I mean, so much of the money spins and spins and spins in trading strategies. The part that's left for actual investment in these things, let alone in the places that you're talking about. I've spent a lot of time trying to build enterprises in precisely those places. So just to give you one example, a business called Ignite Power. We started in Rwanda, Mozambique, Kenya, and now across West Africa as well, Nigeria. That is an enterprise that started with the very poorest people getting access to energy through solar. Now, that business is incredibly sophisticated, digitized, mobile phone based, all the payment systems. It's highly advanced. And it's a rent to buy structure, but it's enabled people who had no access to power to have power and to gradually increase their capacity to join in the real economy. Now we've added internet access via Starlink. So you can have a rural school in Rwanda that's got power on the roof, can charge up their phones, they can run the entire operation, you know, on digital and access to, for good or ill, everything that's on the internet. You know, that's not exactly straightforwardly good, but it's there, right? That's a massive leap forward in terms of development, and it's affordable. These are these are people of very limited means who can afford to pay for this proper commercially, not a gift. So I'm now, I can also tell you that we're about to go on a capital raising program to deploy a lot more money to go across Africa. I don't know how that's going to go. I might have to come back and report. But the truth is that whether it's this company or dozens of others like them, that's where we need capital flow. And sometimes when I go and speak to institutional investors, I get the same very frustrating response. You get this far, climate change problem is definitely an issue, and we're definitely doing we made these investments, we've got these people working on it. And then you say, and what about the deployment of your capital into emerging markets? Don't really understand the risk. And I said, you pay 2% to BlackRock to manage squillions, and you're telling me you can't get properly informed about the risk in East Africa. You can't find people who are going to tell you, or let alone India. They might actually go to India now, right? And some do, but then the misperception of risk is extraordinary. So I would happily sit down with someone who, you know, I sit on an octopus board. I bet if I sat here with Greg Jackson, we went through the default rates for their customers in the Midlands, and I compared them to mine in Rwanda, I bet I win. I bet the default rates amongst Ignite Power's customers in East Africa will be lower. That's my bet. And what about the technology? Well, where's the technology risk in installing solar? It's not that high. Political risk, Rwandan government. Have we got strong and stable government? Look, I think we've got the perception of risk completely out of whack. The cost of capital is therefore far too high from those countries. The flow is poor. Yeah, it's bad. And the multilateral development banks have helped. We often go into these jurisdictions with results-based financing programs with the World Bank. But the private capital to run the business is just that. Private capital didn't come from them. They were never going to help us build the business that way. They'll run programs that we can profit from, but they won't create the enterprise. That needs risk capital, and there's just not enough of it. There's not even enough of it here. The amount of money that flows into risk capital here is pitiful from those very same pension funds. There's another debate. I know we're going over time. There's one other example, of the potential to unlock creativity. I'm really quite happy, which is the kind of university spin-out space, which has been very productive for some sectors, obviously for many years. Very productive here, where I'm involved with one at Imperial College called Undaunted. And if I ever want to lift my mood, feel like things are possible, I just go to the presentation days of the new businesses through the Undaunted program. I mean, that is phenomenal. And they're not all young people in these businesses. They're people of a certain age who have come back around, but the range of innovation, the type of innovation, the range of businesses and I'd like to build structures that specifically reward them for what they deliver in the real world, the outcomes they achieve. We don't have a taxation system or a regulatory system that does that. I think if you could do that, it might be helpful to release more capital. But we still need to talk to the big pension funds about what they're doing with their asset allocation, because it's pitifully inadequate to our needs as a society, whether we're here or in Rwanda.
I'm so sorry, but I think we might need to wrap up just because we're over time, but
No, just the one question.
okay.
Go fast. Go fast.
I want to very simplify everything, just to put it simply.
Yeah.
I just connected what you're actually talking about. Is it if you look at the last data about the releasing CO2,
The one thing too that you mentioned, nobody knows what's going on with the climate. You're absolutely right, nobody knows how fast climate is changing. This is first issue. Secondly, when you look at the problem, what you're talking about financial always, when you look at two things, you're talking about capitalism and the environment, they totally, they opposite each other. If you want to make a profit and work in the environment, how these two things are going to work? You have this environment changing, you negotiating because you're thinking about profit. How this two stuff is going to meet, slow down, or somebody, I think its approach has to be completely changed.
I do think, I believe it's possible to do that. I think you can build enterprises that make profit and solve problems. But I also think we need to be a whole lot more creative about what the structures are that specifically reward and advantage those who do solve these complex problems. We have elements of it where we can have incentives for, we have incentives to build renewable energy businesses. We don't need them anymore, but we had them to start with. We've had attempts to price carbon, which is a useful indicator of the value of saving carbon, but has only been peripheral in making big changes in the way we move our money. But I think the answer lies initially and ultimately in thinking, in the way we think about how we build enterprises, what enterprises are for, how we motivate ourselves in the forms that we choose to take, whether it's on our own or in how we vote or the societies we belong to or the enterprises we build. What we do with the autonomy and freedom and capabilities that we've got to solve these problems. That's ultimately a
But
philosophical.
if you don't have the choice, if the climate is going to change, if the crisis comes.
The climate is changing. I mean, we just
Yes,
have to.
but I don't think so. I'm looking around. I don't think so. There is an awareness of the.
Well, I think it's quite a good level of awareness about climate. I mean, in this country, there is. In fact, there is in many of the parts of the world we've talked about. There's a very high level of awareness of climate problem in China. Amongst the Indian population, I think you find there's a very high level of awareness amongst decision makers and not so much, but it doesn't matter so much whether it's called climate change or it's called access to water or energy or impoverished soils. You don't need to label everything climate change to have an intelligent response to climate change. Many of the domains where we have to do the most work to get positive stuff done can be done without a climate change label at all. The challenge is to find that common ground where you can alleviate poverty and deal with access to clean water in an intelligent way to respond to climate change. That's the area of focus. We better go and have a drink.
Thank you so much. Principal staff of this lecture, everybody from the college who enabled us to have